Are men becoming more passive? Yes, it appears that in some sense they are. They're becoming more passive in that they're bailing out of society. Boys don't do as well in school pretty much from day one. They're less likely to enroll in university. They're more likely to drop out. They're less likely to graduate. They're withdrawing. And there is evidence that I think is quite compelling. Perhaps this is most advanced in Japan and South Korea, which have very low birth rates, that young men are even bailing out of the sexual game, even if it's solitary. There's some indication that young men aren't even masturbating as much as they used to. That's how emasculated and demoralized they are. And that's all a consequence of, that's all a consequence of this insistence that all manifestations of masculine will are part of the force that is not only a continuation of the historical pattern of power and oppression, which is, of course, what our society is entirely based on, but the purest manifestation of the destructive human force that's demolishing our beloved earth. And, if you tell boys that from the time they're young, especially if they're actually ethical people, then, well, why wouldn't they be demoralized? Obviously, the right response to that, if it's true, is to be demoralized. But it's a pack of lies right from the bottom up to the highest levels of abstraction. Talked to a man named Marion Tupy the other day. He wrote a number of very good books, 10 Global Trends I think it's every educated person should know. I really like that book. He just wrote another one published in August of 2022 called Superabundance. And he calculated, there's this idea, a Malthusian idea that, there's too many people on the planet and that we're going to hit some kind of limit of growth and then we're all going to starve. And that was really a big idea in 1967 with Paul Ehrlich, who believed that we were going to hit a population bottleneck by the year 2000, that there'd be starvation of hundreds of millions of people, and of course, and that commodities would shoot up in price and there'd be scarcity of everything. Typical Malthusian viewpoint, kind of based on analysis of yeast. If you put yeast into a medium, the yeast will multiply until there's too many yeast for the medium and then they all die. And that's a biological viewpoint, except only if you're simple-minded, because we aren't yeast and human beings are ingenious, which economists know perfectly well because the economists always scrap with the biologists about this. And there's no limit to the extent of human ingenuity, and there are no obvious limits to prosperity and abundance whatsoever, assuming that we're not stupid. Marion Tupy and his co-author analyzed historical data looking at the relationship between population expansion and abundance, which is a positive relationship in that as there have been more people born, since there have been more smart and competent people born, which is a necessary consequence of that, we've got richer, not poorer. And the Malthusians say, yeah, well, the other shoe will drop eventually. It's like, yeah, specify your time frame, buddy. You don't get to have an infinite expanse to prove your hypothesis correct. It's like, well, human beings might go extinct in 100 million years. It's like, well, probably we won't worry about that. And if you can't specify the time frame, then you have a useless hypothesis. And a man named Julian Simon actually forced Paul Ehrlich, who wrote The Population Bomb, into a corner because he bet him, and a famous bet, that by the year 2000, not only would there not be mass starvation, which there obviously wasn't, but that commodities would get cheaper rather than becoming more expensive. And he let Ehrlich, the biologist, pick the commodities, and Simon won the bet. And Tupy has extended that work to a basket of 50 commodities and has demonstrated now that each child born produces 7 times as much wealth as they consume. So enough with there are too many people on the planet, and human beings are a destructive force, and all male will is nothing but a cancer on the planet and part of the oppressive patriarchy. It's like, that's all. There isn't a shred of evidence for any of that, except that when human systems degenerate, which they do fairly frequently, they degenerate in the direction of allowance for the expression of power, arbitrary compulsion. And so if your marriage disintegrates, you're going to start playing power games with each other. If your friendships disintegrate, same thing. Relationships between children and parents, if they're not optimized, they degenerate into power games. Same in business organizations. and political communities. But the fact that our social systems can degenerate into power games doesn't mean that that's what they're predicated on. And I think the evidence, so Frans de Waal, great primatologist, has been studying chimpanzees for a very long time, and chimps have a patriarchal social structure in that the primary structure of a status relationship in the troop is male. There's female hierarchy as well, but the males are predominant, superordinate, unlike the bonobos, by the way, which are closely related. There's a trope that Marxist biologists established that hierarchies are dominance hierarchies, and the dominance hierarchy is dominated by the most dominant male, and that implies the male who's most willing to use arbitrary force and compulsion. But de Waal has shown very clearly that, well, that sometimes even the smallest male can become the alpha if he has, for example, the support of an older female who has very good social connections within the troop, and if he's extremely good at reciprocal interactions and reconciliation post-conflict. And that what establishes peace and tranquility and prosperity, let's say, among chimpanzees is peacemaking and reconciliation, friendship, essentially, maybe something like the spirit of voluntary play, and an optimally structured social system from the microcosm, say, husband and wife, to the macrocosm, a large corporation or a state, to the degree that that's governed by the spirit of voluntary association and even play, then it's optimized, as Jean Piaget, the developmental psychologist, was at pains to establish too. So not only are we not governed by the satanic expression of power dooming us to a kind of authoritarian hell, what we're properly governed by is something like the spirit of voluntary play. And so that's all good. That's all necessary to know for young men, because they're taught so often that their ambition is somehow intrinsically corrupt, and the best thing they could do is just, slough off into a corner and maybe die without making too much noise. I had a friend who committed suicide really because he believed that. It took him like 20 years to die. It was pretty painful to watch, but he definitely believed all that. He did everything he could to nullify himself. It was very painful. And so this happens a lot. And then the other thing that accompanies it is, well, men who quell themselves to that degree also suffer the shadow problem, which is all the unlived life, ambition, aggression within them, sexual desire, that just goes underground. And then, well, that's what accounts in part for these explosive, violent crimes. Certainly accounts for a lot of gang crime, because gang crime, that's been established beyond a shadow of a doubt, is all status jockeying. So, and of course, men are unbelievably motivated by status concerns, because women primarily choose men on the basis of their perceived status. That's a bit misleading, because women actually use status as a marker for productive generosity. So if you have to sum someone up quick, you might think, well, does he have resources? But the women aren't, unless they're unsophisticated, they're not really interested so much in the resources, although that's not nothing. What they're interested in is the ability to generate the resources, because that's a much better resource than just resources. Because you could have a useless guy who inherited a lot of money, as opposed, say, to a guy who doesn't have a lot of money but whose prospects are bright. And a sensible woman will take the latter guy over the former, and certainly be in much better condition to have a sustainable and enjoyable relationship. So, women often get a bad rap, especially from people in the manosphere, so-called, for being hypergamous, which means mating across and up socioeconomic hierarchies, because women have a preference for men, young women, who are about 4 years older than them, who are as well off or better off than they are. And it's a female calibration mechanism to remediate the inequality placed on women in relationship to pregnancy and infant care. So a woman takes a vicious hit in terms of productivity when she becomes pregnant and has an infant. And so it's in her appropriate interest to find a man who can fill that gap. And she's wired, so to speak, to look for someone approximately as competent as her or more competent. And why wouldn't she? What, she wants another child around? That's not helpful, obviously. And so you don't want to be another child. Now, women who can't distinguish between power and authority or power and competence, power being the ability, let's say, to use compulsion, will and ability to use compulsion. So that's a good definition of power. Women who can't distinguish that from authority and competence, maybe because they never had a good relationship with a single male in their entire life, they'll quell all of that just to get rid of the power. But all it does is fragment their relationships, make it impossible for them to have a functioning, intimate relationship. They're hell on their boys and not good for their daughters either. It's a very bad, low-resolution attitude. It can't help but generate resentment. It's a terrible thing when it gets established multi-generationally. So I think Warren Farrell wrote a book called The Boy Crisis, told me yesterday when I was talking to them that every single high school shooter was fatherless. So, I mean, you know, that's a small sample of people, but society seems to be, let's say, degenerating into a more and more woke direction. Well, some of that is pathology of ideological possession, so that's never a good thing when a society becomes more authoritarian in its political requirements. So, for example, many professors now, junior professors, before they're hired, they're required to formulate a diversity statement, which is basically something like a vow to adhere to the tenets of a monotheistic empathy. And it's an appalling political requirement. It's absolutely 100% inexcusable. And that sort of requirement is being smuggled in at virtually every level of social interaction, academia and in business, with the ESG movements particularly. And that's appalling. My response to that has been, don't say things you don't mean, and don't go along with things you don't agree with. I told my kids when they went to school, look, kids, follow the rules, but don't follow stupid rules. Who decides if they're stupid? Well, that's a hard question, because most of the time you should follow the rules. But now and then the rules get pathological, and you have to stand up. I said, if you're going to stand up and break a rule, think about it, and you have to be willing to take the consequences. But there's consequences to not standing up to stupid rules too. And if you think that those consequences are lesser, then you suffer from the delusion that there's an easy path through life. You know, as a clinician, often my clients were stymied, say, in their careers. They had a job, maybe laboring for a boss who wasn't good for them, or they were in a career that wasn't good for them for any number of reasons. And they were afraid to change. You know, they were afraid to put themselves on the job market. They were afraid to face the horror of their CV or resume with its gaps and inadequacies. And, you know, sometimes we had to spend a year strategizing about retraining that would make the CV attractive, to address the avoidance that they had engulfed themselves in up to that point, so they weren't presentable on paper. It's a hell of a thing to face. That's a dragon, right? All your past sins shine out from your CV, and so people are terrified even to open the document often if they're thinking about searching for a new job. And then, you know, it's hard to search for a new job, and you know, you send out 50 resumes, you're lucky if you get one positive response. So the rejection rate is extremely high, which is good to know as a baseline. It's not you. It's like everybody gets rejected 95% of the time. You only have to succeed once. And then maybe you're not good at interviews, and maybe you try hard and you don't find another job. And that sucks, because you actually tried hard and you failed. And so often people pull their punches so that if they fail, they can always say, well, I didn't really try that hard. But that's not very helpful. But usually, almost inevitably, people who put their CVs in order and then sent them out, and then were willing to learn how to be interviewed, and were willing to be rejected 50-1. In my practice, most of my clients who underwent that process doubled or tripled their salaries within 2 or 3 years. Now, it wasn't easy. Like, they really had to work at it. But they were willing to confront what they needed to confront. We know, for example, that self-consciousness, so imagine you think about yourself all the time. What's that associated with? Well, it loads on neuroticism. The more self-conscious you are, the more miserable you are. That's why self-consciousness brought tragedy into the world in the story of Adam and Eve. So the more self-conscious you are, the more miserable you are. It's not about you. Do you want it to be about you? How about if it's about other people? Well, the more you think about other people, if you go into a party and your goal is to make everyone else feel at ease, you won't be anxious. But if your goal when you go to a party is, I don't want to be anxious, all you'll do is think about how anxious you are, and all that'll do is make you awkward, and all that will do is make you anxious. And then you'll have a miserable time at the party. And it's a kind of narcissism. I mean, look, I know people have social anxiety. I know it's terrible. But one of the ways I help people overcome their social anxiety was to say, look, the next time you go to a party, really try to focus on other people. Like, don't try to not focus on yourself, because that you just fall into a loop then. I can't stop not thinking about myself, or thinking about myself while I'm not thinking about myself. But you can really concentrate on other people. Like, when I meet people, I've probably met at least 10,000 people face to face in the last 4 years, probably more. And those were semi-formal meetings where I shook someone's hand and asked them their name. So when someone comes up to you and you want to introduce yourself, if you really pay attention to them, the first thing you can see is you can see their tempo, because people move at different rates. Some people are very quick, some people are very slow, and you can extend your hand in a manner that's exactly matches the rate at which they approach you. And so instantly they know you're paying attention. It puts them at ease. Then you grip their hand and you can exactly match the pressure, or maybe just slightly firmer. So someone with a firm grip, you give them a good crushing, and someone who's gives you a weaker grip. I kind of don't go to the lowest end of weak grip, because I don't like cold fish handshakes. They're a mistake. And so a bit of firmness is all right, but you match that too. And then you ask the person their name, because when people meet me, it's often in situations where they're nervous because of it. They're lining up with other people, and it's an event, and they're nervous, and so they're afraid of making a fool of themselves. And so matching their tempo and their hand grip and looking at their eyes, like really intensely, watching them, then they see that I'm dancing with them, and it makes a little circle of intimacy almost instantaneously. And then if I ask them their name, everyone remembers their own name. And as soon as they manage to get that right, then they're set at ease. And you can get unbelievably good at that. I had to learn that as a clinician, because lots of people would come into my office and they're terrified to be there. They didn't want to be there. It took them like 2 years to get up the courage to go see a therapist. And so part of my job was to make them as comfortable as I possibly could instantly. And a huge part of that was paying attention to them and not to me. And you can get really good at that. Yeah, so when I was a kid, almost all my friends in the town I grew up in dropped out of school by grade 10. Then I had a new crop of friends because I stayed in school. And it wasn't like the boys who stayed in school were more admirable. They certainly weren't to me. They were often more obedient. And it's very hard for tough, cool young guys to differentiate between that kind of passive, mindless, immature obedience and accomplishment. And so they would look askance on achievement at school, because it was hard to dissociate that from just being a teacher's pet, just being a suck-up, or being someone who's hasn't got enough guts to stand up to the system. One of my friends, for example, John Peppard, he was a tough, cool kid, really funny, vicious sense of humor, a lot of older brothers, pretty scrappy kid. He could easily take on guys that were 2 grades ahead of him. When he was 15, 16, he basically challenged our gym teacher to a scrap at the hockey arena. And that was quite the damn challenge. The gym teacher's name was also John, and John was a good guy. I liked him quite a lot, and he was strong. He could do an iron cross, no problem. He wasn't tall. I was about 5'9", I think, and I guess my friend John was about 5'7" by that time, but he was a scrappy kid, and he basically challenged the phys ed teacher to a scrap at the hockey rink, which took a hell of a lot of courage. And John was one of those kids who, he was done putting up his hand to go to the bathroom when he was 15. It's like, I'm not putting up my goddamn hand to go to the bathroom. I'm a man. It's like, you, I'm not putting my hand up to go to the bathroom. And, you know, they kicked him out of school. And I can see why. He broke the rules. But he was an admirable kid, and he went off to work on the oil rigs and when he was 16. And that's no job for wimps, I'll tell you. In northern Alberta, where it's like black fly hell and mosquitoes everywhere and 40 bloody below, and you're likely to lose a thumb if you're lucky, and that's all. And, you know, he made a fair bit of money and spent most of it on wild living. But lots of my friends were like that. They were tough kids, and it was very hard for them. They're cynical of things like cadets or Boy Scouts and man, I tell you, the late 70s, that was a great time for cynicism. We had all the cynicism of the hippies and none of the hope. And all those tough kids, they dropped out. And it was very hard for them to distinguish between compliance and accomplishment. And so for the guys out there who are listening or who are tough and cool kids and are skeptical about school, what do you want to grow up? You want to be illiterate? You want to be inarticulate? You're going to have to negotiate. You're going to have to lead. You're going to have to convince. You're going to have to think. You want to be highly literate to do that if you want to be cool in the most fundamental sense. You want to be cool like Jocko Willink? That's a good example. Man, that guy's like 3 feet thick. He's as tough as a bloody boot, and he's up at 4 a.m. every day. And he is one literate person, man. He can make an argument. He led his men in his military career. And then, you know, if they did something heroic, he could write up a report and describe it, what they did in detail, and get them promoted and get them recognized because he could communicate. And so if you're tough and cool and you're dubious about achievement, it's like, do it on your own terms, man. Make your own plan. Decide what sort of man you want to be. And then develop the skills. And don't be thinking that it's somehow Oedipal to be literate, because that's a damn fool notion, man. The great men I've met, they're unbelievably literate. And they are compelling when they talk, and people listen because they know what they're talking about, and they speak with authority. So if you're tough and you're cool, you're going to want to do it on your own terms. And our school system's very bad at facilitating that. In fact, it does everything. It was even designed at the beginning to not facilitate that, because our school system was based on the Prussian military model, and the Prussians, who also trained the Japanese to establish their school systems, by the way, they wanted to produce obedient factory workers and obedient soldiers. There was no autonomy. There was no development of autonomy built into that. And so in our culture, which prizes autonomy, and rightly so, our kids are confused, especially the tough boys, because they think, well, it's admirable to be autonomous, and yet I'm supposed to sit here like a good little boy, you know, far beyond the time when sitting here like a good little boy is actually what I should be doing. So they get sick of it, contemptuous of it, but to their own detriment, especially on the literacy front. So make your own damn plan. Develop a vision of who you could be. And you can do that by finding people you admire, you know, notice who you admire, and then see if you can figure out what they're like, and then practice that, you know, that instinct for admiration. That's your undiscovered future self beckoning to you through the guise of someone else. That's why you're gripped by it. And pay attention to that, you know, and don't sell yourself short. Don't let the foolishness of the school system and its inane requirements for passive, slavish obedience dissuade you from taking your proper place. It's not helpful. It won't do anyone any good, and it'll deprive the world of what you have to offer. So that's a big mistake. Nietzsche said, in order to develop, you have to subordinate yourself to something. Voluntary slavery, in some sense, to some end over some protracted period of time. And that's the proper conceptualization of discipline. You take it on voluntarily, and then you do have to subordinate yourself to it. You have to listen. You have to obey, but you can do that with the end of freedom in mind, the goal of freedom in mind, freedom and autonomy and responsibility and generosity, all of that, and authority. And so don't sell yourself short, and don't let the people who demand slavish obedience, you know, that puppy dog style of living, don't let them short circuit your future because, you know, you're not inclined towards that kind of obedience. That's actually a virtue, not a vice, even though it's punished certainly in schools, especially by Oedipal female teachers. Although, there's no shortage of men who are participating in that as well. I started thinking about that likely as a consequence of reading both Freud and Jung. Freud was very interested in the idea that there were both undeveloped and repressed parts of the personality, in some sense lurking in the unconscious. And for Freud, much of what was made or left unconscious was often part of the domain of either sexuality or aggression or both. And so those are, in some sense, monstrous domains. And when Jung developed the monstrous domains, in part because I suppose the most monstrous person we can really conceptualize is a truly sadistic sexual predator. So someone who combines uncontrolled sexuality with uncontrolled aggression. So the essence, in some sense, of monstrosity. And Jung believed that he furthered the development of those ideas with the hypothesis of the shadow. You could imagine that the cast-off parts of you, or the parts of you that aren't well developed, have the aspect of partial personalities because they're states of being, patterns of information, patterns of perception that can possess you. So, for example, if you become very angry, then you may say or do things that not only do you regret soon afterwards, but that you don't even see in some sense as part of yourself. And Jung believed that it was useful to, in some sense, name and imagine the sub-personality elements that might make themselves known, for example, in compensatory fantasies. If you're picked on, you might have fantasies of revenge, sometimes very violent. If you're extremely sexually deprived, or maybe not even that extremely, you'll have sexual fantasies. And if you're revengeful and feeling oppressed, and then you might have violent sexual fantasies. That's a part of you. So let's say that's the shadow. And it might be a part that the more strictly moral part of you, so that would be the Freudian superego, or it would be the part of the psyche that Nietzsche would have described as the morality of cowardice. Nietzsche believed that people often were afraid to do things that other people would disapprove of, say, or that maybe they themselves would disapprove of. They didn't perform those actions or think that way because they were moral, but because they were afraid of the consequences. That's why people can go off the rails during a riot, because they believe they won't get caught. And so the fear disappears, and then the lack of morality makes itself manifest. In any case, Nietzsche, Freud, and Jung all believed that there was often undiscovered value in the cast-off or undeveloped parts of the personality, even if they were grounded in unacceptable sexuality, possibly, or aggression. So someone who's a bit of a milquetoast, let's say, to use an archaic expression, some man whose fundamental orientation in life is to be liked, maybe rather than loved or respected, who wants nothing more than to avoid all possible conflict, and who would never dream of offending someone with, say, an unwanted sexual advance, might simultaneously be restricting himself to such a degree that he poses no threat and commands no respect either among men or women. And what that means, and he may find that extraordinarily frustrating, and that may in turn lead to the generation of rather pathological fantasies, or at least the harboring of an intense feeling of resentment. A man like that needs to integrate some of that cast-off material, the potential for aggression, the potential for sexual motivation, desire, action, needs to integrate that into his personality. That's the revaluation of good and evil from the Nietzschean perspective. Nietzsche wrote a book called Beyond Good and Evil, and one of the things he posited was that in times of moral crisis, both personal and social, that the set of distinctions between what constitutes good and what constitutes evil have to be reevaluated, and that many things that might have heretofore been regarded as evil need to be recast as good. And that's certainly a notion that Jung incorporated into his idea of the incorporation of the shadow. Also, the incorporation of the anima or the animus. So the anima for a man is the feminine part of the personality, and the animus for a woman is the masculine part of the personality. And that would be underdeveloped and also cast off, in some sense, for moral reasons, but needs to be integrated so the personality can have more flexibility in response across a broader range of situations. And so, to some degree, you could conceptualize that, and it is conceptualized in literature as the incorporation of a monster. So, the classic female myth, I would say, insofar as it's not the hero myth, because it is that in part, is the myth that's laid out in the story of Beauty and the Beast. And so, in the Disney version, which does a very nice job of laying this out, Beauty is a entirely commendable female. She's attractive and wise, intelligent, ethical, devoted to her father, but not in a pathological way, independent. She has everything going for her. She's the target of the advances of a narcissistic Machiavellian, Gaston, who's like a parody of masculinity. He's sort of, you might think about him as the feminist's patriarchal nightmare in animated form. He's all bluster, and although he's attractive, it's a superficial attractiveness that often characterizes narcissists. And Beauty is wise enough to actually prefer the beast, who's a beast, but also capable of standing up to Gaston and also prevailing, which is the advantage of the beast-like element, but also capable of being enticed by Beauty, and maybe literally so, into first of all, a productive orientation for his proclivity for aggression, and also into a productive and generous relationship. And Beauty being a wise woman and oriented towards the good and characterized by a positive relationship with her father, which is stressed, by the way, in that movie, wants a tameable beast. And that is what women want. They want someone who's productive and competent, but also capable of enough aggression to keep the real monsters at bay. And that's a very narrow needle eye for women to thread, because you need a man who's aggressive enough to keep the real monsters away, but simultaneously agreeable enough, empathic enough, generous enough to be good with kids, to be good with her, and to share. And so that's a very fine line. And the taming of the beast is, in some sense, the negotiated establishment of that line. So there's a book called A Billion Wicked Thoughts that was written by Google engineers who are quite reliable social scientists when they put their minds to it, engineer types, because they tend to follow the data independent of any political inclination. And they looked at patterns of pornography use among men and women, drawing on literally billions of data points, A Billion Wicked Thoughts. And they found something that had been reported previously, but this was on a very large scale, that men use visual pornography. I don't think that comes as a shock to anyone, but that women's preferred pornographic art form is literary. Women like stories. And they analyzed the canonical female pornographic fantasy. And it's basically, surprise, surprise, 50 Shades of Grey. And so the Google engineers identified 5 categories of men that were often the feature target for the romantic and erotic adventures of the female protagonist in the pornographic stories: pirate, vampire, surgeon, billionaire, and one I can never remember. But you get the idea. High status guy, right? It's pretty disagreeable, doesn't take any nonsense from anyone, sort of floats above the female world in some sense, hard to tie down, but is then entranced by this one particular woman and falls into a relationship with her that's often contentious and conflict-ridden, because there's no drama if it's easy, and then eventually ends up taming him in some sense, which means locking him to her in this erotic and romantic embrace, and accompanied by plenty of hot sex. And so that's the female pornographic fantasy. And it's not any surprise at all to me that 50 Shades of Grey, which is basically that story on steroids, was the biggest selling novel in history and was also extraordinarily popular right in the midst of Me Too. It's exactly what you'd expect if you were a psychoanalytic psychologist, because what you see is that when the culture and the individuals that compose it drift too far in one direction, Me Too would be all male will is potentially corrupted by power and to be regarded with suspicion and legal regulation. Well, that's far too extreme and preposterous. And so what you have is a compensatory fantasy emerge that's highlighting the value that's not being properly attended to by the culture. And it possesses people in an unconscious manner, you might say, in an attempt to bring them back to the middle. And anyways, that's all part of the tameable monster. And so it's a good thing for men to know, because, especially young men, because now in our society, young men are constantly told from the time they're in kindergarten and maybe even earlier, depending on their parents, that we live in an oppressive patriarchy and that all manifestations of male ambition are nothing but will to corrupt power, and that the best thing for any man to do is nothing, if he is nothing, really. And that's the castrating great mother from the Freudian and Jungian perspective, that's for sure. And that's certainly where we're at in our culture. And it's very useful for men to know that that aggressive impulse, that capacity for aggression, which is also the capacity for competition, is also the ability to protect borders and to set limits and to impose limits, necessary limits on children, all of which is hyper necessary. The ability to be properly competitive in a social realm, and something that can be socialized to the nth degree and be unbelievably useful. So a man who's capable of aggression but has it under control is a way more useful man than one who cannot do that for lack of ability, or because he's imposed or incorporated arbitrary moral constraints on his perceptions and behavior that stop him from being able to say no, for example, because saying no is an act of aggression. Because what no means stop doing that, or something you do not like will absolutely 100% happen to you. And so without that, there's no capacity to say no. And, well, if you can't say no, you can't negotiate, you can't move forward, you can't live your own life. You can't put limits on Machiavellians, you can't oppose narcissists, you can't emerge unscathed from people who use empathy in a manipulative way. You can't put constraints on a badly behaving 2-year-old. And so, no and aggression, and integrated aggression, those are pretty much exactly the same thing.